Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here. So the first question I get, and I've been all over this country speaking on this issue, is how does somebody from the Federal Reserve who worries about business cycles and inflation and unemployment and income inequality and on, how do you get involved in early childhood education? So the first thing I'm going to do this morning is give you that backstory. I'm going to explain, how I got roped into it by Todd Otis, and then I'll go into the research. Now, I got into this research. It's not original research by me. I'm the pretty face of this issue, guys. I just kind of took the research with a colleague of mine, and we took an economic lens to it, okay? But the research was out there. And when we finished this report, I thought we were saying the obvious. I thought we were done when I handed this report over, and it's been 15 years now, and it's been nonstop. So I'm going to talk about that research, try to convince you that it really is overwhelming, and the takeaway is that I want you to think about early childhood development as economic development. And I'm going to argue, we made this case 15 years ago, that it's probably the best public investment we can make. And we made that argument nationally, and 15 years later, no one has refuted that, okay? So that's going to be the takeaway, but I'm not going to leave you there. Because there's one thing to say, the research shows we can get a very high return by investing in our most vulnerable children. Something else to say, how do you implement it? How do you take it into the real world? And so the last part of my talk is going to tell you the story about how we actually went about implementing it, and it happened because of your business community in this state. A man by the name of Warren Staley, and I'll get into Warren later, but he was at the time CEO of Cargill. Wouldn't have happened without Warren. But so the business community got behind it, and we did this private money to show we can do it really well. And then I'll conclude by talking about not just the success we had with our pilot study, but how we're taking it to scale here in the state of Minnesota. And I'm going to tell you the numbers. The data keeps coming in stronger and stronger. If anything, go back to my original study, we underestimated the return on investment. So, and then maybe my final comments will be on the political situation, and we'll get into some of the issues, on the political issues of where we're going with this. Sort of a call to action if you feel in that direction. Okay, so how do I get started? So I was at the Federal Reserve for 40 years. Started when I was 12. But going back about 20 years, there was a group of us, about 30 or 40, that would meet for lunch in downtown Minneapolis. And, these are downtown people, a variety of types. And we would invite somebody with a passion, somebody with an issue. It could be a politician, it could be a lawyer, it could be a CEO, it could be an academic, a media person. This particular lunch, roughly 15 years ago, was Todd Otis. Todd, at the time, had just been appointed the executive director of an organization called Ready for K. It was an organization that was founded with the help of former Governor Al Quie and former Mayor of Minneapolis, Don Fraser. Interesting, Republican, Democrat, getting together, ready for K, ready for kindergarten. And Todd is up in front of a group like this with beautiful pictures of young children in an early learning environment. And he's trying to make the case for early childhood education. And he finishes, I don't know Todd well, but I raise my hand and I say, Todd, this was my mistake, by the way. I understand the argument you're making, but I don't think you're going to get very far with it. Essentially, what he was making was a moral argument. It is the right thing to do to help these kids out. Okay? I said, Todd, you're a legislator. You have limited dollars. And there's lots of good arguments, moral arguments you can make for investing more in K through 12, investing more in higher ed, investing more in worker training, and reducing crime and reducing pollution. We can make all kinds of moral arguments. I said that policymakers with limited dollars, have to kind of rank these, have to figure out where is the best way to invest these limited dollars. So I naively said to them, to Todd, I said, I'm guessing you could make an economic argument for this investment. Well, that was, like I said, that was my mistake, because the governor calls me up, and Don Fraser calls me up, the mayor, and then Todd starts calling me up, saying, Rolnick, we agree. How would you like to come on the board and do the research? And I try to explain to them that my expertise is pre-Civil War banking. Okay? That's what I know. Early childhood education meant kindergarten to me, but you know, it's a mayor and a governor, and hard to say no. And so, and my board of directors at the Minneapolis Fed, very supportive of what I was going to do. So I got the okay to go ahead and do the work. Although I had a young colleague who headed my public affairs economic education outreach program. He was working with high school students and teachers on the economics of the Fed, and I figured his name was Rob Grunwald. I said to Rob, he must know something about this. I said, Rob, I've committed us to doing this research. But I said, don't worry, I'm pretty sure there's these studies out there, these longitudinal studies that we can go to and kind of glean the economic argument. And that's what we did. Okay. So we wrote the paper. Took us a few months. Todd was kind of poking me, you know, where's the paper, where's the paper? He actually took me out to lunch, was very nice to me. Not really, he said, where's the paper? We finally got him the paper, and I figure I'm done, right? Here's what I promised to do. Here's the paper. We're done. Well, little did I know that these guys were going to start pushing it out. And today, you know, it's easy to electronically to push this stuff out. So like I said, 15 years ago, we gave them this paper, and I thought I could go back to my office and go back to my old pre-Civil War records and continue working my research, but the phone started ringing off the hook. 6 months later, I find myself in Orlando, Florida, National Governors Conference, the guest of then Governor Jeb Bush, who was way ahead of this issue in Florida. About a year after that, I'm in Istanbul, of all places, the guest of the president of Turkey, and there's 400 delegates from all over the Middle East and Europe, and the Queen of Jordan is there. And I'm the keynote speaker. Are you kidding me? And not about the Fed, but about early childhood education. In fact, the Queen of Jordan, she has a website on early ed. But the biggest thrill for me was shortly after that, I was speaking in Washington, and the lawyer for KinderCare, for Mike Milken. Most of you are too young, but Mike Milken was the so-called junk bond king, made a lot of money in the 70s and 80s. Unfortunately, he did some things he shouldn't have done. He ended up in jail for a while, but he gets out of jail and he creates two foundations, one on cancer research, because he had prostate cancer, and the other on education. At that time, they owned KinderCare, and KinderCare is an international early ed program. And he invites me to come to Beverly Hills, California. He runs every year this economic summit. And he puts me on a panel with Andre Agassi. Now you have to understand, I'm a weekend tennis player. So there's Andre. I go in the speaker's room, and there's Andre Agassi, and he comes and he introduces himself to me. He says, "What's a Fed guy doing here?" And I said, "Wait a minute, what's a tennis guy doing here?" Well, some of you may know this. He has a foundation. Him and his wife have started a foundation in Las Vegas. They have a charter school for low-income Latino children. And fortunately, we started chatting, and I gave him my pitch on early ed, and they've been adding an early ed program, so I feel good about that. Okay. So that's how I get started. What did we say in this essay that brought me to all these places? So I'm going to take you through the economic argument. And again, since I'm going to try to convince you this is economic development, I'm going to first talk about the wrong way to do economic development, where we're spending, in this country, literally billions of dollars, and the return is zero. Okay? I know I can beat zero. So what am I talking about? Well, the most recent example, which many of you may have heard, is Foxconn. Governor of Wisconsin just announced this company from Taiwan, which was coming to this country. There was no question. It was a question of where they were coming. Okay? And Wisconsin came up with a wonderful package, $3 billion subsidy for a $10 billion company, 3,000 jobs. You can see why you know, the governor would be excited about doing this for his economy. Why am I saying deals like this are a zero return? Zero. Why do I say that? This company was going to be here in this country. From a national perspective, just 3,000 jobs are going to be here somewhere. What they did, very smart, they got, I think, about a half a dozen states bidding for that company. And so $3 billion in public money that could go to reduce all taxes for all business, which would have been a much better investment, or it could have been used for education or infrastructure. As you know, we've got tremendous infrastructure needs, or it could have been used for early education. It's going to a private company to create 3,000 jobs that they were going to build that they were going to create in this country anyway. And by the way, that's the best case scenario. Many of these deals don't come through. They're high risk, many examples. And this has been going on for years. In fact, the New York Times, they had the data that I didn't have. They estimate anywhere from $50 to $70 billion a year is spent by cities and states trying to lure each other's businesses. When I was first working on this issue many years ago, I used Lawson Software as an example. I don't know if you remember, it was in downtown Minneapolis. The mayor of St. Paul lures Lawson to downtown St. Paul. You could understand why St. Paul wants that company. If you go downtown St. Paul, you'll see that office tower. From St. Paul's point of view, they're happy. They cost them $100 million public money, but they got these new jobs, et cetera. But they took them from Minneapolis. Zero sum. From the state's point of view, we lost $100 million in public money. We gave it to a private company that would have created those jobs anyways. It's a zero return. We dubbed that the economic bidding war. I won't go into it. I actually was involved in getting a bill introduced in Congress. Didn't go anywhere. Sports guys killed it. Shouldn't surprise you. You don't want to get me started on stadiums. Okay. Don't want to get me started. But it's a general problem. Okay. So I'm going to argue that's the wrong way to do economic development. So prior to Todd Otis and the governor and the mayor getting me involved in early ed, if you asked me, okay, Rolnick, if that's the wrong way, if Prior Lake or Minneapolis or St. Paul, if that's not what you should do, what should you do to promote sustainable economic growth? My knee-jerk reaction would have been, invest in your human capital. Invest in education, job training, et cetera. It's critical for long-term success. And when I spoke in Minnesota, I said to my audiences, like you, I would say, you should know this. Why do I say that? So we did a study a number of years ago. We had a study, we had data on Minnesota's economy from 1920 to the year 2000. And we tracked Minnesota's economy. We looked at per capita income, or the amount of goods and services the state produces per person. And started in 1920, compared to the nation, we were well below average. We were not one of the strong economies. 1950s, we're still well below the nation, or maybe close to the average, but still below. Starting in the 50s, this economy starts to take off relative to the nation. By the year 2000, we're one of the best economies in the country. How'd that happen, guys? Wasn't the weather. Wasn't the weather. So historically, I can't give you a good answer for this as why we moved in this direction. And it wasn't the GI Bill, because this was unique to Minnesota. We start pouring money into education. By the year 2000, our women are like number one in the country in terms of high school degrees and two-year degrees beyond that. In fact, if you look at our overall quality of our workforce in terms of education and training, et cetera, we have one of the best, highly educated, trained workforces in the country. This was in the year 2000. So you could say it's a correlation, but I'm going to argue it's causality. You build a quality workforce, and odds are you're going to attract good businesses. In case you don't know it, we're like number 1 or 2 in Fortune 500 companies in this state. Where did that come from? Quality of our workforce. We surveyed many of the CEOs of businesses, small and large. We asked them about location decisions. And high on the list, if not number 1, was quality of the workforce. So that was an argument I would have made, and I did make 15 years ago. And then I start getting into the early childhood education space. And this is when Rob and I started looking at these longitudinal studies. There's 4 of them. I'm going to talk about one, but I'm going to tell you we get the same results, virtually the same results in 4 independent studies. The famous one is known as Perry Preschool. Perry Preschool starts in the early 60s, Ypsilanti, Michigan. Somebody had this bright idea, you know, maybe if we work with kids earlier than kindergarten, especially our most vulnerable kids, maybe we're going to get some better results. That was the hypothesis. Okay, let's see if it's going to work. So what did they do? They had 123 at-risk families. They randomly divided them up into two groups. Okay, so again, the methodology doesn't get much better than this. Half the kids get a high-quality early childhood program. So what do I mean by that? Master-level teachers, small classroom size, outstanding curriculum, a lot of playtime, and working with the parent. I want to reiterate, working with. This is not just about taking a child and putting them into a center-based program. This is a parent-focused approach. These are 3- and 4-year-olds. Today's dollars, roughly $10,000 per child, 2-year program. So we knew the costs. And the 10-year study that came out was very interesting. They were tracking IQs of the kids. And the IQs of the kids who were in the program go up like this. But by 3rd grade, it's back down to almost the same as the control group. Remember, we're always comparing to the control group. So Perry was actually viewed as a failure after the 10-year study. But they kept tracking the kids, and when Rob and I got a hold of the data, we had 30 years worth of data on these kids. And we found that we looked at outcomes. So for example, the kids who were in the program, got the high-quality program, they were much less likely to need special ed. They were much less likely to be retained in a grade. They were more likely to be literate by the 6th grade, graduate high school, get a job, pay taxes, stay off welfare, and the crime rate, again, between the two groups, down 50%. Well, that looks like a pretty good deal. And we asked a very simple question. Nobody quite had asked before. What was the return on that investment? This is what economists would ask, business people would ask. You invested 20 grand in the kid. What was the return? And, you know, so I said, I know I can beat, you know, another corporate subsidy. That's a 0 return. But if I'm going to go to St. Paul and make the case that we should be investing more in high-quality early education for our most vulnerable kids, I got to beat the market. What's the market? Because we're going to take money out of the market, out of the private sector. We better get a better return. So what's my hurdle there? Post-World War II, stock market, inflation-adjusted return, annual rate of return is 5.8%. Not by 401k, unfortunately, but that's what it is. Okay. So I said to Rob, we've got all this data. We could put dollar values on virtually all these benefits. So we know the cost of special ed. We know the cost of retaining a child. We know the financial benefits of having a student succeed in high school and get a better job and pay taxes and stay off welfare. And we could put dollar values on reducing crime, which are enormous. They're growing every day. So we have the dollar value of benefits, the dollar value is a cost, and there's a formula that you plug that data in and you back out the implied rate of return on that investment. So I said, Rob, here's the data. We had that formula on the computer. Plug it in and let's see what we get. We got to beat 5.8%. If we get 6.5, 7, we can go to St. Paul and make our case. We got an 18% inflation-adjusted return. I said, Rob, that can't be right. In fact, it's embarrassingly high. It's not believable. Please go back and do it again. So he does it again, 18%. So I take all this data and I send it down to the University of Chicago. A man by the name of James Heckman, he's a Nobel laureate, working on the same issue at the time, fortunately, looking at the Perry Preschool study. I said, Jim, here's the data that we have. We get this incredible number, and I'm a little embarrassed by it. Could you check it for us? Took a few months. I get this cryptic email from Jim, 18%. During the time Rob and I are waiting for this for Jim to get back, we're investigating Perry Preschool a little bit more, and we realize that 18% is a lower bound. Why is that? Well, we're doing a lot of parenting here, and these families have more than one kid, so we have siblings. Odds are the siblings are doing better. We didn't have data on the siblings. We found out anecdotally that we're changing the lives of these families, and in a number of cases, we knew these parents went back to school. Many of them had dropped out of high school, or they went back to work, or both. So their income was going up and their lives were improving. We didn't have data on teacher productivity. Now, many years ago, I'm from Detroit. I used to teach in the inner city of Detroit, third grade math. I can tell you, when the kids came into my classroom and they were engaged, I was an amazing teacher, one of the best. But when they came in and they barely knew their names, I failed. Didn't have data on teacher productivity. Odds are, if we're getting our kids healthy and ready to learn by kindergarten, all students are going to benefit. Teachers are going to do it because they can do more teaching, all right? And worry less about emotional IQ and cognitive IQ. They've now got students ready to learn. It makes a huge difference. Didn't have data on productivity. Obviously didn't have data on children of the children. We think we're going to find that we're making some headway on reducing intergenerational poverty as well. And finally, this may be the biggest return. We didn't have data on health metrics. We're finding out through the National Institute of Health and CDC that your health metrics are highly correlated with those foundation years. In fact, James Heckman went back to one of these longitudinal studies, the one that was done in North Carolina, and he got the data on these adults that were in the program, and he found a significant improvement in heart disease. We didn't have any data on that. So, okay. So 18% is a low return. That was our study. That's the study that ended up Istanbul and with Andre Agassi, whatever. That's what got me around the world because, you know, I thought we were saying I thought it was obvious. Once we looked at the data, I thought it was pretty obvious. Bottom line, we're underinvesting in early childhood education for our most vulnerable kids. And in Minnesota, as you know, we have, if not the highest achievement gap in the country, one of the highest achievement gaps. And these significant number of these kids are going to end up, if they're successful, they're going to be a big part of our workforce. If we fail, there's a moral argument, obviously, but it has a big economic impact, negative, if we don't succeed with these kids. So, I'm in Boston giving a talk like this, and a man pulls me aside, invites me up to Brandeis. He's the dean of the Heller School up at Brandeis. Now he's at Harvard. And he says, Art, you know, I know you're looking at Perry Preschool. I know you're thinking of doing a second essay. That is, how do you take this research into the real world? He said, just want to make one point with you. Your 3- and 4-year-olds, for the most vulnerable kids, 3 is too late. I really didn't know what he was talking about. Man's name was Jack Shunkoff, and he's the co-editor of a book that was written in the year 2000, Neurons to Neighborhoods. It was what the neuroscientists were learning about brain development. What he was showing me is that a high percentage of our brains are developed by age 3. In particular, what he shows, if a child's in a stressful environment, and I want you, for the purposes of my talk, to think of poverty and stress as pretty highly correlated, that brain doesn't develop right. The extreme example, which you may be familiar with, is the Romanian orphans. If you remember, the Romanian orphans had very little interaction with adults. They were just fed 3 times a day. And they did brain development on those kids. They did brain imaging on those kids at 3. Those brains were a third smaller than what they should have been. When Jack Shunkoff talks about this, he says, debate between nature and nurture is over. We know that environment is critical for that brain development. I thought the big problem was going to be abuse, and I've been mentored and taught by a number of organizations around the country. The big issue is neglect. That in poverty families, under a lot of stress, these children are often neglected. That is, they're put in front of a TV, there's very little interaction with adults. And so we've got problems by age 3. You can't wait till kindergarten to solve these problems. The gap starts right at the beginning. So Jack said to me, okay, Rolnick, if you're going to make a proposal to implement this research, you better start early. And early really means prenatal, okay? I'll get into that a little bit later. So think of the challenge. We need to engage parents and empower parents. This is parent parting in this is critical. So one challenge is appearance. We have to start early. It's got to be quality. It can't just be a child care where they put the baby in front of the child in front of a TV. There's got to be a quality program involved. So it's got to start early. It's got to be parent-focused and engaged. It's got to be quality. It's got to be targeted. We're not talking about upper-middle-class kids here. These aren't the kids that drop out of school and end up with problems in life. It's clear the achievement gap is the problem. So keep that as the focus. So it's got to be targeted. And finally, if we're going to do this, we better be able to scale it. If it's one principle or one great program that depends on a particular individual, that's not scalable. There's a man who's very famous in this field. His name is Jeffrey Canada. He runs the Harlem Children's Zone, and he's been featured in a movie, I think, called Waiting for Superman. And what Jeffrey did in Harlem is he created this incredible high-quality early ed program, and if you were to go there and sit in their classes, it's amazing. These are kids from Harlem coming from abject poverty, and they know French, they know Spanish, they're doing math. It's amazing, his courses. But Jeffrey started out helping about 200 kids in Harlem, and he realized he's got 2,000 kids, and if he's not doing it, if he can't bring it to scale, he's failing. So scalability. So those are the challenges. So this second essay, what did we propose? It's pretty simple. We proposed early learning scholarships. Now, why do we like early learning scholarships? Why do we think those meet the challenges? Well, targeted, okay? They're targeted to the most at risk, and if we have the funding, we can go 300-400% over poverty, make sure working families have access to scholarships as well. So, but targeted, because I know that's where I can get you your double-digit returns, if you will. Empower the parent. We let our parents get engaged and figure out what program works for their child. You know, my reading of the research, one size does not fit all. My own experience, I got 2 boys, totally different, right? And so we want our parents, maybe they'll choose New Horizon, maybe they'll choose Head Start, maybe they'll choose a public school program, maybe they'll choose a faith-based. Let them figure it out. Let the parent figure it out. Get that parent engaged. Scholarship. So scholarship engages and empowers the parent. It's targeted. Quality. The scholarships we're proposing have to be used at a 4-star rated program. Okay, so that makes sure that people say, well, how's a parent going to know? Well, we provide the information on the star rating, on the rating. Okay. Scalability. I'm telling you, the 3 of us could run this program statewide. We don't need a big infrastructure. It's fairly easy to do, to administer this program and to bring it to scale. Doesn't depend on one person. It depends on the market. You're listening to an economist, right? Markets are pretty powerful tools. Empower these parents to choose high-quality programs, and the market will deliver. That was the theory, okay? So, wrote that second essay, and I mentioned Warren Staley. So, fortunately, Warren Staley, CEO of Cargill at the time, and his foundation was working with teenagers from low-income families, and they weren't having much success. And we sit down for coffee, and I said, Warren, you're starting too late. So he had me come talk to his foundation. Then he was chair of Twin Cities United Way at the time. Talked to their board and sort of gave a talk like this. And so afterwards he comes up to me and says, okay, Rolnick, this sounds good in theory. Let's get you out of the ivory tower there at the Federal Reserve and bring you into the real world, and let's do a pilot. So Warren Staley, on his own, creates a nonprofit. It's called the Minnesota Early Learning Foundation, MELF. The idea, 5-year, it would sunset after 5 years. And that, knowing it would sunset, helped him to recruit some of his friends on the board. So who else was on the Minnesota Early Learning Foundation board? Well, Ken Powell from General Mills, Doug Baker from Ecolab, Brad Anderson at the time from Best Buy. We had Charlie Weaver. Charlie Weaver, formerly Governor Palente's CEO, now heads the Minnesota Business Partnership, represents well over 100 businesses around the state. We had Bob Rolnick, who was president of the University of Minnesota at the time. We had the CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield. We had one of the presidents from United Healthcare, because this is as much about health as it is about education. We had a very strong business-oriented board. It was headed by Dwayne Benson, former state senator, and Dwayne, with Warren, went out and raised, and with the board, we went out and raised $20 million. And we did it fairly quickly, and you can ask, how did that happen? Well, at the first board meeting, again, these are all Warren's friends, Warren says, okay, guys, Cargill's in for $5 million, what are you in for? So that's one way to get it started, right? So, but it took some work. It wasn't quite that. But we ended up eventually getting $20 million, and here's what we did with $20 million. We needed a rating system because we needed quality. So we worked with the University of Minnesota, worked up some metrics for how to rate programs. It's called Parent Aware. It is now statewide, but we started it, and the idea was our scholarships have to be used at a 3- or 4-star rated program. And then, with most of the rest of the money, we circled a neighborhood in St. Paul, Frogtown, a little bit north of Frogtown. Why? Because the mayor of St. Paul, Mayor Coleman, got wind that we were going to do this, and he wanted to be the first one out of the chute, and he offered up his staff to help us. And we needed help. Why did we need help? We were going door to door, asking parents if they wanted a scholarship. And they're looking at us as, who are you guys, you know? Well, fortunately, we got some faith-based leaders, we got the mayor, and we've got some other community leaders coming with us. And eventually the word got out that we were not the bad guys, the good guys. And within a month or two, we ran out of money. We gave out 650 early learning scholarships. And I forgot to mention, our scholarships included funding for home visiting coaches starting prenatal. Remember, one of the challenges was to start early. Our scholarships are not just for the 3- and 4-year-olds. It includes home, and that's a very important part of this program. So again, parent-focused, start early. We have mentors starting early. So when we knocked on the door and the parent accepted our scholarship, by the way, it was all voluntary, it included a mentor. And if we were good, we got to that mom prenatal, because it makes a huge difference if that child's born full weight, full term, and not addicted. I'll get into this a little bit later, but one of our pilot transformation zones, we call them, is White Earth Reservation. A couple years ago, half the kids up in White Earth were born addicted. You can't wait till kindergarten or age 4. You've got to start at the beginning. And it's a huge benefit to all of us if these children are born full weight, full term, and not addicted. The costs to societies are enormous when that's not the case. So that was a scholarship model, 650 families. We bring in an outside evaluator, Stanford Research, formerly known as Stanford Research Institute, SRI, to come in a couple years after we had the program started to evaluate how successful we're doing. And the results looked really good, but the thing that affected me the most was focus groups we did with the parents. We asked the parents, well, what did you think of the program? What did you think of the scholarships? Well, there were critics. I should back up. Here's what the critics said to me when we started this program. Rolnick, it's not going to work. Why isn't it going to work? Because Frogtown doesn't have 3- 4-star rated programs. These parents are going to be frustrated. There's no place to go. These programs aren't going to work because many of these parents are so disengaged they won't even use the scholarships. These programs aren't going to work because you better make sure they're all culturally sensitive. So it's sort of interesting to hear the critics push back on this. I said, well, let's see what happens. Because my view of this, once the market learns that we have 650 families with scholarships paying over, actually we paid close to $13,000 a year. Within 6 months, New Horizon opened up a brand new facility in Frogtown, right down Rice Street, just north of the Capitol, on a bus line. Montessori expanded their program. A bunch of faith-based groups expanded theirs. St. Paul School expanded theirs. Even Head Start looked at me a little funny. They weren't so happy initially, but then when they started getting some of our scholarship kids, we actually paid more than what they were getting for their kids. So all of a sudden we were okay. Within 6 months, every one of our parents had a 3- or 4-star program to choose from. And of the 650 families, only a few didn't use the scholarship. Parents are parents. They all care about their kids. The few that didn't use it, one moved out of state. A couple parents had special needs kids, which we didn't cover. But virtually every parent used the scholarship. And what about the culturally sensitive? A dear friend of mine said to me, Rolnick better be culturally sensitive. I said, who's going to make that decision? 6 months into it, New Horizon opens up. If you were to go into the New Horizon on Rice Street, at the very beginning, you go in there, and you would have seen Hmong culture all over the walls, history and literature and everything. Why was that? Most of the parents that went to that New Horizon were Hmong. They're going to respond. They're their customers. They can choose to go to Head Start. They can choose to go to Montessori. You want to keep those customers? You better be culturally sensitive. Markets work. So fortunately, SRI comes in. We do these focus groups, like I said. The parent says to us, yeah, we love the scholarships. And yeah, that's right, there was another criticism. Somehow kids who got the scholarship will be tainted. It'll be like, welfare or something. It was just the opposite. Because I said, my comment was, listen, if your kid gets a scholarship to go to Harvard or MIT, I don't think you're tainted in any way. And sure enough, the parents said they couldn't believe somebody cared that much about their child to give them a scholarship to go to high-quality early ed, New Horizon, for example. So they loved the scholarship. We asked them about the mentors. And they said there was a lot of bonding that went on between these mentors. These weren't social workers telling parents they're bad parents. These are coaches that are working with the parents and helping them do a better job. So a lot of bonding went on with these. So they loved their mentors. And some of these parents pointed out it meant so much to them that somebody had their back. So if a car broke down, they have a medical problem or something, they could call that mentor, and the mentor was going to be there to help. Lowers the stress in the family. As a neuroscientist would tell you, you lower that stress, more likely that child's brain develops better. So this all works together with the research. Their big concern was K through 3 going to be 4-star rated? Now think about this. We have parents, many hadn't graduated high school, and their biggest concern is they want that quality to continue. They saw what it meant to their kid, and I declared victory right there. Because I know the key to getting this double-digit return is the parents. I know there are great programs out there. I'm not worried about that. But we need these parents to have access to these programs and to get engaged and empowered. It's all right. Great. Don't be sorry. Mine rings all the time. Well, hopefully it's not an emergency. So, fortunately, because the results were so strong, we were able, and I got a chance to give a talk like this to a White House summit a number of years later. But money was put into Race to the Top for states that had innovative early ed programs. The state of Minnesota got, I think it was $45 million to replicate what we did in St. Paul. So as we speak, we're replicating it again in St. Paul, North Minneapolis, headed by Northside Achievement Zone, which is another incredible organization. I mentioned White Earth Reservation and Itasca County. Shortly after that, Governor Dayton did an amazing job getting us $50 million for statewide scholarships, and they're all over the state. And see, what helps us is, and this is Warren Staley's contribution, I'm not just talking theory. I'm just not the economist up on the 8th floor writing an academic paper. We're getting results. We're showing it works in the real world. And it's not just working in St. Paul. It's not just working in Minneapolis. It's not just working for African-American families. It's not just working for Latino families. It's working for all families that are in poverty, all kids that are in poverty. And we want to focus on our most at risk. So we want to make sure that every homeless child, every child of incarcerated parents, every child born into poverty has this program. Because we've got the results to show we can not just close the achievement gap, we can prevent it. So session before, St. Paul gave us $60 million, a year to ramp up the scholarship model. And so as we speak, you know, we're up to about 18%. Actually, the last session we got another 10 million, so we're up to 70 million a year. And I'm estimating this number. We're about 18% of our poverty kids are covered now. And so over the next 2 years, and I'll conclude with this, where I think we're going to go with this, where I know we're going to go with this politically, is we're going to push to take the scholarship approach, what I call the Minnesota model for early childhood education. And I'm now advising a dozen different communities around the country who are looking at doing something very similar to what we're doing here. We want to take it to scale. Think about it. If you're a corporation and I told you you got 18% return on investment on a product, how long do you think that would go underfunded? It would be fully funded virtually overnight. So we're arguing from a public point of view, it sounds like a lot of money because we want to go from 70 million to 400 million. Sounds like a lot of money. I don't know, the K through 12 budget is about 6 billion or something. Relative to that, it's not that big. Relative to this economy, gross state product in this economy is $330 billion a year. There's a notion that we can't afford this is suspect, let's just say. So I want to take this to 400 million. We're already showing huge cost savings, public costs. I mean, clearly there's a private benefit here, but I'm arguing much of the return is public. Because the critics will say, wait a minute, this is the parent's job or the mother's job. Why should we get involved? Well, because if you don't, the health care costs, the education costs, the criminal costs, the costs of this economy are enormous for all of us. So that's the argument for public investment. I don't start out, in fact, and Todd Otis knew this and so did Governor Kuya, I start out very conservative on government intervention. I said, I want to, show me the money, show me the return. This program has this high return. This is why going from 70 million to 400 billion, no pun intended, this should be a no-brainer. This should be easy for us to do because of the return here. And not just the return now, but just like in the 1950s when somebody had the foresight to realize how to make this one of the best economies in the country, this is how to sustain it. So I'm from Detroit. I'm working with the Kresge Foundation there. 75% of the children that go to the Detroit high schools don't graduate. This is a comment I made at the White House. I said, I don't care how much money you give to General Motors. If you don't educate these kids, it's a third world economy. What do you do in this economy if you don't have a high school education? I mean, you can imagine, right? Nothing good. So that's our, over the next couple of years, we're going to be working across the aisles. This is an apolitical, this is just, I'm making it not even the moral argument. The moral argument is there. I'm making it an economic argument. We can't afford not to do this. We should bring it up to scale. We've got the results, and I've got the support from Fortune 500 companies, Minnesota Business Partnership, leaders of virtually every minority group in this state arguing that this works. This is what we need. Our kids have to succeed. So where's the pushback, guys? Where are the headwinds? Well, I'll tell you where the headwind is, and you can maybe advise me on how to manage this, because I don't think I've done a very good job, and I was a bit surprised. So I had been working, I said 15 years, 10 years before I heard a word from the educational community on this issue. Finally, I hear from the teachers union, the higher-ups at the team, not the teachers. Teachers knew this right away, but the higher-ups at the teachers union are finally weigh in and say, yes, early ed's important. We've got to do this. And I've testified. I said, I know we blame our school system for this achievement gap. They got 1 to 2 hands tied behind their backs. This starts at the very beginning, well before they get to kindergarten. They're not the problem. They're going to do much better if we get these kids healthy and ready to learn. But the teachers union comes in and they say, well, our proposal, now that we recognize that early ed is important, we want universal for public school only. So wait a second. 4's too late. And it's very expensive. You know, and if you're going to do this for all kids, that's you need 400 million plus just to do it for all 4-year-olds. And that doesn't include if you're going to make it public school only. If you read the fine print in the proposition, in the proposal, they need $1 billion plus for infrastructure because the public schools just don't have the infrastructure to do this. Scholarships, we don't need much for infrastructure. We got all hands on deck. We got all kinds of infrastructure out there already. Before it's too late. And then I ask, why public school only? I don't get it. And I asked the Commissioner of Education, who was making this argument, Brenda Cassellius, who I know very well. I said, Brenda, well, why are you arguing public school only? She says, oh, we have research to show that the public schools will do a better job than New Horizon and Montessori and faith-based. I said, please show me that research. It just so happened New Mexico had done a study like this. They looked at private versus public programs. It was a toss-up. Great public programs, great private programs. And I said to the governor, and I said to the Commissioner of Education, we need all hands on deck here, guys. We've got some great programs. And then I said to some of the proponents of the public school only, this one, very nice, and somebody I've known for many years. I said, she was arguing at public school only, 4-year-old. I said, where did you send your child, and where are you sending your grandchild? Oh, they went to Montessori. So wait a second. It's all right for your kid to go to Montessori, but you're not going to allow a parent to choose that. They might choose public schools. Many of our scholarship kids, by the way, chose Head Start and chose St. Paul Public School. About half, I think. We're not cutting the public school. We need the public schools. We know some of them are going to be terrific. But why would you go universal for public school only? So that was the headwinds. And got a lot of media attention because we had this debate. 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, whatever it was, I sat down with the governor and Speaker Dowd, and we worked out the compromise. That's when we got the $60 million for the scholarships. And then the public school got some money for their universal pre-K, and they call it voluntary pre-K, whatever. So it's sort of interesting. We can compare the two approaches. And in much of there's some terrific voluntary pre-K programs, by the way, but often they're only 2-3 hours, and they're not a day, and they're not in the summer. Our scholarships are 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, include the summer, et cetera. So that's where we've been battling. I actually think because the scholarship model is having so much success that in the next round, and the new governor, and I'm talking to both sides of the aisle there, I think we got a good chance of bringing it to scale. But there's always going to be some headwinds. And so we got to work that through. So if you're so inclined and want to get involved, let me know. If you've got people that you think would be influential in helping move this along, I'll be happy to talk to you. So that's, as you can tell, I've got an agenda. And I'll be happy to answer any question. Thanks for the opportunity, by the way, to speak to this group.